Francesca, who has been there for a lot of the field work, and she's also known Alan since his Chicago days. I don't know, maybe before? Well, you'll talk about this. I
in
won't.
the Chicago days, latter Chicago.
Officially, since then. Okay, so Chicago, Francesca's talking about grammar, poetics and social relations, Chicago to Sahul. So just easy enough.
This guy is really...
333. Yeah.
You see what kind of a tyrant this
Yeah. So only when it gets done.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, hello everyone again, and thank you all for coming. I'm very grateful to you all for coming to this, and I particularly want to thank, first of all, Tony for coming all the way from Texas, like the boll weevil and the little black bug, as they say, and Nick for being so thoughtful about organizing it and bringing Tony. For Rob, a really old friend who knows us from our Catherine days and who's here, and the many other people who are here that we've known for so long, whom I shall not name at this time. So I just want to say a little word about Tony. I've actually known Tony since 1980, and I first met him when I went to Chicago for a conference. Alan and I were just married, and I went to Chicago, and Alan said, go see my friend Tony. So I did. I showed up on his doorstep. He was living in an apartment there, and he hospitably invited me in and offered me a sample of his whale blubber that he had out on the porch, which I thought was pretty unique because I hadn't really had any chance to have whale blubber before. And then, interestingly, Tony did most of his early field work in Alaska. And so comparing that to Chicago, I distinctly remember that he used to call his field site the Bering Riviera. And I thought that was very appropriate as we all froze our way through Chicago. Anyway, so that's how long I've known Tony. Well, for something a little bit different here, I want to depict work-life integration, if not balance, in this presentation. I want to combine some things about Alan's family background and person, and some things about his professional training and work. As you know, it's hard to keep those things distinct, so my purpose is not to keep them distinct, but rather to indicate some of the links. So Alan was born in upstate New York, Glens Falls to be exact, a place that Rob's also been, to a mother who, here we go, a mother who came of a Quaker background, and a father who became a Quaker as a young man, and worked most of his life for the World Friends Committee. Alan came along with an older brother, Eric, that you see on the left here, and a younger sister, Gay, and here Alan is about 10, they're in Ohio. And he has a larger kindred distributed over New York and the Midwest. Alan's mother, Margaret, or Maggie, as she was called, was described by a friend of hers as a Quaker first, as a feminist and a Democrat. And she is remembered by those who knew her as resourceful, practical, and sharp. Around the house, she was the one able to fix or make anything, and at the same time devoted endless hours to her job as a community service person, did voluntary work also, for example, on behalf of the League of Women Voters in Wilmington, Ohio, where the family lived from 1953, when Alan was 3, to 1962. She was an excellent cook in what I might call the homely and healthy American vein. She could make a good meal out of anything and could bake till the world looked level. But in that Midwestern milieu of Alan's youth, she was seen as gastronomically adventurous for cooking chow mein, for example. There is, in fact, a picture of her in the Wilmington Journal of 1959, which I will spare you, of her doing just that. She was a sort of exhibit A of multiculturalism avant la lettre. And Alan has often remarked on the fact that his father, Robert, whom you see here, considered spaghetti simply too foreign to find a place on the dinner table. This at least adumbrates what was for me, who am from a mongrel European immigrant background, the exotic quality of this all-American life world. I think Alan inherits a certain all-round tinkering and fixing habitus in the maternal line, and this is probably best revealed in comments that his sister Gay sent me. She says, about her principal recollections of Alan in his youth. I have to say that he was always tinkering around with electronics or chemistry sets. In Wilmington, Ohio, he would many times be found in the dirt cellar that smelled like horrible mildew and dampness, and he had his chemistry set all out on the table, and he was always putting together concoctions and experiments. Then when we moved to Portland, that was in '62, he had a little room in our basement where he had all his ham radio equipment, and he would always be building and putting together pieces, and then when he got his ham radio operator license, he was always talking to people in other countries. I remember him also learning Morse code and being totally impressed that he could communicate with people all over the world with this dot and dash system. And his older brother Eric remembers him very much in that sort of vein, his experimentation with batteries, his building of crystal radios, and all sorts of things like that. Now, I think that's a maternal sort of line inheritance. Certain other things I think about Alan are most directly traceable to his father. Robert loved music, and in his youth was an accomplished baritone, president of his high school music club, and he sang for all kinds of comic and serious opera, church gatherings, and other events. I think it's most likely in this line of descent that Alan comes by his love of music, which has found expression in every stage of our life and travels. Alan, of course, did his field work in Australia in the Kimberley, so I want to follow this musical thing for a moment. Alan did his work in the Kimberley, as we've said, where he enjoyed the evolved tradition of country music that people at Mowanjum played and listened to. A visit at our house in Sydney from David Morjali, one of Alan's friends from Derby, whom you see here, morphed into long sessions of listening to Frank Sinatra records, which David loved from the time he picked up some musical tapes from American soldiers during World War II. And James, our eldest son, made a comment on that, and he said, one of only 2 times I ever saw Dad cry when I was a kid was on the day that David Morjali died. When we did fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, Alan was a keen follower of song genre. One of his boon companions in this was our counselor Noma, who was a fine singer in Western Highland styles. In election time, Council Noma used to record songs on his tape recorder and walk around playing them as a siren song to his electors and potential supporters. Council Noma and Alan aroused all kinds of excitement for their joint participation in nighttime courting events, which always involved this kind of ton and head, which people will be familiar with, and singing. And some locals, I think, always harbored the hope that Alan would, in the end, take a second wife. Alan sought to introduce this tradition of turning head into Northern Australia, for example, to my sister, Alice Mitchell, who thought it was a hoot. So there's Alan turning head with Alice Mitchell. Alan also set about recording what in our PNG Valley are called these Tom Yaya Kange that have already been referred to. In Hagen, they're called Kangarom. And these are basically these chanted tales of daring do that tell of the exploits of young men who set out into the world, marry, and achieve success, Highland style. There are many dimensions of Highlands life that are, in a word, a boys' club, but these were occasions that allowed Alan to develop his musical interests. Alan collaborated with and supervised Don Niles in this work that Nick Evans showed of the sung tales or the chanted tales from the New Guinea Highlands. Don did a huge and magnificent thesis of 200,000 words on Hagen music, which would not be accepted here at ANU because it's too big. And Don, unfortunately, was unable to come for this occasion. Here's Don, who's now acting director and senior ethnomusicologist in Beijing. Of course, in Germany too, where I went to do field work, we gravitated as a family to the many musical people and events. We found traditions of family music were very lively there. So there you see us little bit dark, but me and Alan and James, our son, in the background playing the violin, and Familie Kraus on this left-hand side. And Alan here in Canberra, as you may know, has played in a contraband for years. I also want to point out that in Catherine, here's Stefan Kraus and Alan perfecting their Ländler. In Catherine, where we spent long periods of time working on Catherine Landline, and Alan was involved in that, he was also recording music, and here we see a fellow who was a friend of mine, Dick Garlouis, and another companion of his playing the didgeridoo. So I think that's an inheritance in Alan's paternal line, this love of music. There's another inheritance that I think has various manifestations. It's what I'd call a spectrum phenomenon. It ranges from steadfastness to solidity, to stubbornness, to pig-headedness, and it's one of Alan's most endearing traits, more so in some areas of this spectrum than others. Perhaps I think he gets this from both parents, but most obviously from his dad. As a young man, his dad, Robert, was a worker for the World Friends Service Committee, a registered conscientious objector. In 1940, Robert refused to be inducted into military service in the Quaker tradition, and here I've got a quote from George Fox, of course, one of the great founders of the Friends. Anyway, he refused to be inducted into military service. He was branded a slacker and a glamour boy in the regional media and given a 4-year sentence. Well, that sort of thing, that kind of stubbornness can be very positive in many circumstances where everyone else is dithering around. As I see it, one of the characteristics that Alan has come by is an incredible fixity of purpose and rationale for it, which sometimes in everyday life, as I say, can look a whole lot like stubbornness. And even at times, one might be excused for seeing it as a failure to take in what you just said. Well, just one more note on the family background. When it was Meet Alan's family time for me, we arrived in Plainfield, Indiana, in the heart of a largely Quaker neighborhood after dark. For some reason I don't remember, though it probably had to do with his mother's always being sociable, only Alan's dad was home, watching the National Basketball Finals. It might have been the Seattle Supersonics, I think, against somebody. On my father's side, I come from a very invasive Italian family whose womenfolk especially grill anybody who walks across the doorstep, evaluate their comportment, and eventually find them sartorially lacking. Given that background, I found the rather calm welcome from Alan's dad reassuring, but I had had minimal exposure to American obsessions with megasport, and I didn't understand its importance. Having greeted me cordially, after about 5 minutes, Alan's dad excused himself and locked back onto the TV and the NBA once again. From that, I discerned that Quakerism and American big sport boosterism can cohabit nicely. Alan grew up, as I've been saying, mostly in the Midwest and Oregon. Here's a picture of him in 8th grade. But when his parents were poised to move from relatively urbane Portland back to Indiana, where, by the way, he and I and the boys on one later occasion almost drove straight into the middle of a Ku Klux Klan rally, Alan bailed out. He won a scholarship to Atlantic College in Llanwyd Major in Wales for a year, and here you see him in a role there as the Bishop of Beauvais in a play that's about the life of Joan of Arc. While he was at Llanwyd Major, he was admitted to the University of Chicago, which was to be his academically formative home for 10 years from 1968 to 78, with Tony Woodbury a couple of years behind him, as Tony has said. It's there that some other main academic influences fostered Alan's leanings and left a lifelong imprint. And I want to speak briefly of the 4 men who came to be Alan's PhD panel. But Alan was at Chicago both as an undergraduate and a postgraduate. 2 of these eventual PhD panelists he got to know as an undergraduate, and these are Michael Silverstein, who's been mentioned several times, and Eric Ham, who hasn't. Now, I think everyone who's met Michael Silverstein knows that he is a phenomenon, even now in his 70s. Michael came to Chicago from Harvard as a 24-year-old doctoral student in the autumn of 1970 and taught for the first time a course that became very influential at Chicago and famous, titled Language and Culture, to a group of about 20 people, including Alan. Then he, Michael, went back to Harvard, finished his PhD as quickly as possible. Most of you would not probably believe that Michael's PhD thesis was on numbers in Penutian. And he returned to Chicago. Michael, returned to Chicago in the fall of '72 when Alan was starting his postgraduate work. Alan took that seminar on ergativity that was referred to earlier, in which Michael trialed his ideas, which were later published in 1976 in the Grammatical Categories in Australian Languages, which has been such an influential piece of work. Among several other students, Tony has mentioned who a few of them were: Dee Holisky, the late Tom Smith-Stark. Tony wrote, I believe, a paper on Yupik, Eskimo, and Alan wrote a paper on Arunda in Australia. Alan later overlapped with Michael Silverstein for several months at Moanjum in Western Australia, and here you only see Michael's side on as a young man. Michael had come to work on the language Morora, and Alan was doing his PhD fieldwork that Nick showed us a cover of. Overall, Michael has to be described as very inspiring, very intense, but always operating in the competitive style he prefers. However, I'd say there's a reason for that. Michael once assured me that he is the most retiring person of his siblings, and that all of them in the family, who of course come from a Jewish background, referred to his older sister, a highly successful businesswoman, as Hitler. There is a sort of backhanded influence too. I think Alan took a lesson from Michael about writing accessibly. To explain what I mean, there was the time that Alan and I were talking to Michael about a paper he was writing, and Michael said, "Well, it's not ready yet. I have to invest it with its final turgidity." Despite Michael's enfant terrible qualities, I think Alan benefited enormously from his acute reflections on language and its various functions, well beyond the informational, which Debbie has spoken about. His reflections on language ideology and Michael's model of academic excellence. The other personality of Alan's undergraduate days who persisted into his PhD was Eric Hamp. Eric died just this year, February, at the age of 98, and he continued to be active academically until very recently. Eric was widely respected as a leading authority on Indo-European linguistics, with particular interests in Celtic languages and Albanian. He is probably going to remain the only linguist to be honored by having an Albanian postage stamp issued in his name. Unlike many Indo-Europeanists who work entirely on the basis of written materials, Eric conducted extensive fieldwork on lesser-known Indo-European languages and dialects, including Albanian, Arbëresh, Arbanitica, Breton, Welsh, Irish, and Scots Gaelic. Eric's wide-ranging interests included American Indian languages. He did fieldwork on Quileute and Ojibwa. He also studied linguistic aspects of Braille, and I think there's some parallel there in the breadth of Alan's interests with Eric's. As a fourth-year undergraduate, Alan took Hamp's Introduction to Indo-European Historical Linguistics in a group of 15 around the autumn of '71. Tony was also there, weren't you, Tony?
Yeah, I took it in spring of '71.
Spring of '71.
72.
Okay. And both of them took Homeric Greek from Paul Friedrich, who's been referred to whom I will come shortly. Alan was very interested in historical linguistics and Indo-European and went on to write an MA in that area. Hamp was a very careful reader and exponent of the Chicago ethos of meticulous engagement with empirical detail, theoretical rigor, and argumentation. He also had a kind of Indo-Europeanist nerdy sense of humor. Every year at his house he hosted a tongue party at which the main delicacy was cow's tongue with various delicious mustards. Now, the third mentor is Paul Friedrich, who's been mentioned a few times, who taught at UC Chicago for 5 decades, and he is a true interdisciplinarian, and here again I think there's some parallel with Alan. Friedrich was born into an academic family. Let me tell you a word or two about him of interest. He was born into an academic family. His father, Karl Joachim Friedrich, from 46 to 48, served as constitutional and governmental affairs advisor to the military governor of Germany, General Lucius D. Clay. He advised the American military on the denazification of occupied Germany and helped develop the Grundgesetz, the basic law in Germany. Carl Friedrich became an internationally known political theorist and professor at Harvard. Now, Paul Friedrich, the son, did undergraduate and MA work at Harvard, where he also worked interviewing Russian emigres from post-war Berlin. For his first fieldwork, then, Friedrich went to Michoacan in Mexico with his family, living closely with Tarascans. The results became a work called Agrarian Revolt in a Mexican Village, and some of his other work from Mexico focused on oppositional indigenous politics and their organization by social forces. Friedrich got his PhD from Yale in '57. He had a very mobile career. He taught in India, he went to UPenn, then he was at Chicago from 1962. He taught courses ranging from music and Russian poetry to the Gita within Walden, courses including cultural anthropology, Russian literature, and Homeric Greek, which, as mentioned, both Tony and Alan took from him. Parallel to and intertwined with his academic and scholarly publications, Friedrich produced 7 volumes of poetry. He was known in the ethno-poetics movement and brought together in his teachings poetry from more than 20 different literary traditions. In Friedrich's case, too, I think there is some sort of family influence to be seen. At his American naturalization hearing, Paul Friedrich's father, Carl, whom I referred to, when he was asked his religion, said Homer. Alan got to know Paul Friedrich from 1971 when he conferred with him about graduate programs and decided to continue at Chicago. Alan took courses from Friedrich as a grad student, including this Homeric Greek. More than that, he had many informal exchanges with him. When you went to see him, Alan has told me, Paul would type you out neat little notes about the conversation and send them to you. Alan attended a course with him on poetics and was recently in touch with him when he was doing his work on chanted tales in PNG. So there is another link, I think. And as you saw, he was also a contributor to Friedrich's Festschrift. The last character that was on Alan's PhD committee is, of course, Marshall D. Solons. Solons was born in Chicago. He is of Russian Jewish descent, and he grew up in a secular, non-practicing family. His family comes from Odessa, as does my mother's father's family, and we have occasionally talked about that. Solon studied at Michigan with Leslie White, and most of us remember his evolutionary theorizing, later tempered by the influences of his mentors at Columbia University, including Sidney Mintz, Morton Fried, and Eric Wolf. Marshall became very active during the Vietnam War and often recalls developing the teach-in, inspired by the sit-in of the civil rights movement. Marshall came to Chicago in 1973 when Alan was a second-year grad student. Alan immediately took reading and other courses from Solons, reading the Australian greats from Spencer and Gilden onwards with him. Marshall was and has remained an inspiring mentor on anthropological matters and a friend. Alan's and my major joint book, Kuwaru, that you saw before on our Papua New Guinea work, engaged with Marshall's problematic of history and structure, which he had been developing in his ethno-historical work on Hawaii. Now, engaging with Marshall's work, if not agreeing with it all, ensured a certain readership of social anthropologists who were likewise concerned with questions of structure and social transformation, which Debbie has referred to. Now, I just flipped through a few pictures. I don't want to leave out some of the people that Alan has worked with in the Kimberley. Here was a family and a man with whom he was very friendly, George Brookings from Fitzroy Crossing. You already saw that picture. Here's Alan with a research assistant of ours who unfortunately passed away about 2 years ago, but with one of his little babies. And I think you see both Alan's professional interests in child socialization and his love of little children coming through in this picture. Here's Alan with, again, some neighbor friends and neighbors of ours in Papua New Guinea. Here is a family with whom we have remained friendly for many, many years now. Our friend Wapi and some of her children, and here she happens to be showing off a bill. And here I picked out a little photo, just one of Alan's many academic trips, but visiting our friend Tas Tsunoda in Tokyo, and Tas's wife in 1999. Well, now at this point, I think I'll turn a little bit more to the domestic and immediate personal scene and go back and tell you that Alan and I were married in Tempe, Arizona in 1980, and there we are as young folks. And Alan still had his long hair, which he had for quite a period of time when we first knew each other. There he is, and so we married in Tempe and went off for a honeymoon to the Hopi Reservation. I think it's getting a little too anthropological there. But anyway, I think Alan and I would agree completely that the biggest, best, most important thing, we've been pals, we've been friends, we've been colleagues. Alan is the truest person I know, but the biggest thing ever has been these two little urchins, James and Jesse, who are now big men, and one of them with a son of his own, and the other one married. But here they are at Edith Falls in the Northern Territory while we were working on some of this complex Catherine stuff where we know Rob Blau's from over here. And they're sitting beneath the waterfall at Edith Falls. And so I thought I would give the last words to the boys on what they had to say when asked to produce something, just the first thing that comes to mind. And here's what they said. Here's from Jess, our younger boy. He said, I think one of the most amazing things about Dad's way of working is the way he can cogitate on things when you don't even realize it's happening. I think Dad's mind is always working away like that, and he has a few little things bubbling away on the back burner. It can be confusing and irritating sometimes, because he might seem to get stuck on something inexplicably, but other times it's also kind of magical when you see that all of a sudden he's come up with an idea for why this or that happens in Kuwaru grammar, or how he can make the solenoids in the garden sprinklers. So I just want to refer you back to that tinkering and fixing mode, which is really, I think, well installed in Alan. Now, in a longer screed, which I will not reproduce, our eldest son, James, ended with this word, which I think is a good exe und omnes. Here we go. He said, congratulations, Dad, for all the good work you've done on your own and with your students. I love you bucket loads, and I wish you all the best as you enter the next phase of life. I hope it's fun, interesting, and full of music. Thank you.
Bring this all to life so beautifully.
Okay.
We've got 1 or 2 minutes for 1 or 2 questions. Or
Okay.
corrections by Alan.
Corrections.
Set the record straight.
Did I say anything totally untoward, Ian?
Yeah, just a point of clarification, Francesca.
Oh my God.
Did you say Alan's stubbornness was enduring or endearing?
Well, now that you mention it, I think it's both. Forgive my pronunciation, but I'd say it's both. It's a good thing, though, if you see what I mean. It's got a history behind it. And once you've made up your mind, go away, nothing will happen. But that, yeah. So, any other etymological or other questions?
No, it's a biographical question. I remember that both of you came here as a linguist working on language projects with IAC.
Yeah.
Both went to Sydney, and I believe Alan and John went to the anthropology department. And then you became editor of Oceania, and then 2 years later you both come back here, you're anthropologists. So I haven't heard anything about the role of Sydney University.
Oh, okay. Well, fair enough. Fair enough that you should ask. I couldn't include it all. I mean, Alan, of course, was in a job at Sydney from 1978. We married in 1980. I was back in the United States when we got married, and I came here after that. And then almost immediately after I got here, a couple of things happened. We went to New Guinea for about 2 years on a U.S. National Science Foundation grant, which I could get because I was attached to Arizona, to Tempe. And the other thing was that I did a lot of field work in the Northern Territory. So I'm not meaning to slight Sydney University, where Alan taught, I think, for 17 years. But I just sort of...
Well, Francesca is selling herself a bit short. She had already done 3 years of field work in Australia, but after we got back, I dragged her away from her teaching job in Arizona. She went back and did more, a lot of it more anthropological stuff, women's ceremony and things like that.
Yeah.
But then she did eventually get a job at Sydney Uni and was first lecturer, then senior lecturer, and was actually the convener of Aboriginal studies for all of Sydney Union. At that point, it would be impossible now.
Yeah, probably. So, yes, you're right. There's a long history there at Sydney. It was great. Both our boys are Sydneysiders. They were both born in Sydney.
And one of them is coming back there to our great delight after years away in the States.
Oh, do you have the...
I had a question for Alan, arising from this story about your dad being a conscientious objector. What's the closest you've ever come to being locked up for your principles?
I skipped the Vietnam War, didn't I?
Yes, not very close. I did get status as a conscientious objector in the Vietnam era. But my number, they also had a draft system, a lottery system, and my number didn't come up, so I didn't have to do the alternative service.
So he never had to do the 4 years.
But your dad spent time in jail?
He didn't spend 4 years.
He spent lesser time, and he was reassigned to a work camp. But he got all this stuff about,
He was on
you're
parole.
just a slacker, you're not a this, you're not a that. But he never budged.
Mind you, this was during World War II, where he refused to be conscripted into the army to fight against the European powers.
Yeah, so people took that pretty, with a lot, got a lot of criticism for that. But he was not to be moved on it.